Good afternoon, and thank you everyone for joining in today's meeting. My name is Rob Litvak, and I'm the Senior Vice President at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. For 3 consecutive years, the Wilson Center has been rated as the #1 think tank for regional studies in the world because of the unparalleled quality of area studies that we have in-house. Today, we host a great example of this expertise. A new book on the Indo-Pacific from Abe Denmark, the director of the Asia program at the Wilson Center and a senior fellow in our Kissinger Institute for China in the United States. For those of you who don't know Abe, he came to the Wilson Center after serving in the Pentagon as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for East Asia during the Obama administration. His new book, U.S. Strategy in the Asian Century, Empowering Allies and Partners, has already received great bipartisan comments from a group of senior officials such as former Secretary of Defense Ash Carter, former Deputy Secretary of State Rich Armitage, and former Undersecretary of Defense for Policy Michelle Flournoy. I should note that the book is available on Amazon.com for purchase. The game plan for today is for Abe to give an overview of his book and then to discuss the book a bit further with 2 terrific scholars joining us. Kelly Magsamen, Vice President for National Security and International Policy at the Center for American Progress, and Dr. Ashley Tellis, the Tata Chair for Strategic Affairs and Senior Fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. After those discussions, Abe will address questions submitted by the audience. If you have a question or a subject that you would like him to address, you can submit them anytime by tweeting @AsiaProgram or emailing asia@wilsoncenter.org. I will remind everyone that this event is being recorded and is on the record. And with that, it's a great pleasure to celebrate the publication of Abe Denmark's fantastic new book, and let me turn it over to him for an overview of its main themes. Abe?
Thank you so much, Rob. It's exciting to be doing this. Thank you everybody for tuning in. This is a project that is several years in the making, too many years in the making. And personally, I'm very thrilled to be able to present an overview of the book to all of you. I'll be talking about the book's primary arguments, hopefully for about 20-25 minutes before asking 2 former colleagues of mine, Kelly Magsamen and Ashley Tellis, to come and have a discussion. Again, we're also going to be having a Q&A session with you, the viewers, so please send any questions you may have. You can tweet them to asiaprogram@wilsoncenter.org, or you can email them to asia@wilsoncenter.org. Excuse me, we tweet it to Asia Program, email asia@wilsoncenter.org. Excuse me. I'll be showing some slides throughout this to help emphasize some of the points, and also give all of you something to watch other than me and my headphones. But overall, just very thankful to the Wilson Center for their support in this effort, to Columbia University Press, as well as, of course, to the Smith Richardson Foundation for supporting the project that turned into this book. And before I begin with the presentation, let me just note that if there's any technical difficulties in terms of showing the slides, it is completely user error. And I'm very grateful to the AV team at the Wilson Center for helping us put all this together. So we'll get started talking about the book. And I should note, again, here's the where you can send your questions either over Twitter or email. But I also note that these are my views alone, not those of Columbia University, the Wilson Center, or of the US government. So a little background about why I wrote this book. In April 2015, I was just a few months out from beginning my time as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense in the Pentagon, and Japanese Prime Minister Abe visited the White House, and I was invited to attend this ceremony outside the White House, his welcoming ceremony. and is, but I was already in the beginnings of the project that would turn into this book. In this visit that the Prime Minister attended, the United States and Japan had finalized new guidelines for defense cooperation, which renewed our military alliance to be broader, deeper, and more effective at meeting current and emerging challenges. So alliances were very much on my mind because of this project. The overall topic I was trying to think about was getting our allies and partners to do more. But I was really wrestling with some of the underlying assumptions of that. Why do we want our allies to do more? What do we want them to do? And some of the remarks at that event really shaped the book that I'm presenting now. President Obama, in his opening remarks, noted that ours is an alliance focused on the future, that it's not just military, but they discussed trade, human rights, climate change. And he also noted that Prime Minister Abe's visit had some historic significance, that 55 years earlier, 1960, President Eisenhower had welcomed Prime Minister Abe's grandfather, Prime Minister Kishi, to the White House, where they signed the security treaty that endures to this day, committing the United States and Japan to what they called an indestructible partnership. And that really got me thinking about what that must have been like. And here's a nice photo of the two. It must not have been easy for either of them to get to this point, that Eisenhower had initially been elected in part to get the United States out of a war in East Asia, and here he is committing the United States to defending an ally in East Asia from aggression. And for Kishi, the decision to sign this treaty was deeply unpopular in Japan, and it eventually led to his resignation as prime minister. But moreover, personally, it must have been difficult, I expect, for both men who had both played significant roles in the war as enemies. And just 15 years later, they were able to put aside their differences and come together for the good of their countries, but they did it. And what hit me and inspired some of the tone of this book was that history and the adjustments to the alliance that had been finalized in that month. They reminded me that alliances and strategies change with the times, and must change with the times, or else they risk irrelevance and failure. And that's really what this book is about, change and adjustments. That the Indo-Pacific remains the most geopolitically significant region in the world, but its rise, and especially the rise of China, represent a fundamental change to the balance of power and a challenge to the post-war liberal order that President Eisenhower and Prime Minister Kishi helped build. This book seeks to explain the fundamentals of that change, its implications for the United States, and how Washington can adjust its approach to ensure American power and leadership in the Indo-Pacific sustains through that change well into the future. So to begin that talk, just as a segue, I'd like to talk about China. And we'll talk more about China later, but clearly, to my mind, the rise of China is one of the most significant geopolitical developments in the last 20 years. And as China's power has risen and US-China competition has intensified, scholars and policymakers have begun to look to history for lessons to inform how the US should respond. And I recently published an essay on the use of history to understand the rise of China. But very quickly, there's been several different historical analogies that have been used to try to explain the implications of China's rise. So first, and I think probably most famously, Graham Allison's Thucydides trap, using the Peloponnesian War as an analogy, Thucydides' statement that the rise of Athens and the fear it inspired in Sparta is the cause of the Peloponnesian War. Other parallels that have been used, Wilhelmine Germany and its role in starting World War I. And others have talked about the rise of Imperial Japan and its wars in China against Russia, its colonization of Korea, and against eventually its war with the United States. Each of these do have something important to say, but at some point and in different ways, somewhat quickly, these analogies tend to fall apart. And that's because there are important differences in these analogies. But the one analogy that's taken root more recently, and especially in the Trump administration, has been a parallel with the Soviet Union and the Cold War. And this was especially evident during the Secretary of State's recent speech at the Nixon Center that he made in July of this year. And this parallel seems to make sense on the surface, that both China and the Soviet Union are communists, both are near peer competitors. But if you actually compare the characteristics of the Cold War with US-China competition, they don't really stand up well, in that the Cold War involved separate economic systems. It was primarily, competition was primarily military and especially nuclear. The scope of the competition was global. The two sides saw themselves as ideologically incompatible, and all that meant that the competition was fundamentally seen as existential, that only one could survive this competition, whereas the competition with China, as we're going to talk about, is very different. That our economic systems are integrated, military and nuclear issues are secondary in our competition. The scope of the competition is mostly, but not entirely, regional, that we're certainly ideologically opposed to one another, but I don't know if we're incompatible, in that the competition is not as existential as it was during the Soviet Union, in that China apparently is not seeking to overthrow the American government, and as far as we know, the United States is not trying to overthrow China, although I expect some would like to see it that way. So using that as sort of a jumping off point, this book has four main arguments. And I'll be going through each of these in turn, but fundamentally, it argues that the United States and China are competing over two things: power and order. Shifts in the regional balance of power threaten the foundations of the post-war liberal order, and that as a result of these shifts, the United States strategy must evolve. And it calls for the United States to build its own capabilities, to build the capabilities of its allies and partners, and to adjust its approach in order to revitalize a liberal order for the 21st century. And so thinking about what that actually means, before a key foundational idea that's necessary for this is to distinguish between power and order. When there's debates between American and Chinese scholars, often the Americans will end up talking a lot about order, the Chinese will end up talking a lot about power, and the ideas seem to get intermixed, in that Americans will accuse the Chinese of trying to change the international order, and the Chinese would often interpret this as US opposition to China's rising power. So to make very clear the distinction here, when we talk about power, we're talking about the assets of a nation, its wealth, its military might, its influence. Whereas with order, we're talking about the rules of the road, the operating system of how an international system works, and how it manages contradictory interests between states. And it's important because I do think that these concepts are interrelated, especially in Asia, but they are importantly distinct concepts. And thinking about order, the book talks about the interrelationship in Asia between power and order, and that since the end of the Second World War, the United States has established, expanded, and strengthened a liberal order based on shared laws, norms, and institutions. That although the United States has not perfectly abided by these norms all the time, the liberal order nevertheless was a powerful force that was conducive to trade, investment, economic development, and after 1953 avoided direct major power wars in Asia. So the brilliance of this order, to my mind, was that it served American interests, preserving and advancing American power and leadership, but it was also in the interest of the countries around the world that were able to develop their economies in a relatively stable external environment. And so The book goes into some detail about the benefits of this order, but to keep it short for this presentation, this order was necessary to facilitate the rise of Asia. And no region has benefited more from the liberal order than Asia. First, the rise of countries like Japan and Korea, then the Asian tigers of Southeast Asia, and more recently, India and China. Of course, they owe their development to the decisions of their leaders and of course the hard work of their people, but it was the international environment, the international order that facilitated their rise and their relative security at that time. Yet despite the benefits of this order and the rest of the Indo-Pacific, one of the ironic results of that success has been the emergence of new challenges to the health and success of that liberal order. And the book highlights what I think are the two most important interrelated developments. The first being deepening uncertainties about the sustainability and reliability of American power. And second being the rise of China and China's increasingly assertive approach to foreign affairs and to its own security. So digging into both of these a bit, when I talk about the deepening uncertainties about American power, I talk specifically about concerns about the sustainability of American power in terms of the economic challenges that the world has seen in the 2008-2009 financial crisis, the budgetary pressures that we have of a rising debt, and an aging population with the baby boomers, but also the reliability of American power, that many around the world see the United States as prone to strategic distraction, and especially with the election of President Trump, concerns that the United States is no longer interested in playing its traditional role in the world of being the dominant, some call it a police force, some call it the necessary power in the world, and a power that many of our allies and partners rely upon. And so they're uncertain about us because we seem to be, at least part of us, seem to be uncertain about the world. But of course, there have been exacerbating factors that have intensified these concerns. I mentioned the financial crisis, but also the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, President Trump's foreign policy, and then more recently, the COVID-19 pandemic and how the United States has responded to the pandemic have all exacerbated these uncertainties of the sustainability and reliability of American power. But also I wanted to talk, and I spend more time talking about the rise of China and the importance there. So this is a animated graph on the share of global GDP by country. And you'll see the United States remaining relatively steady, maybe declining a bit, but the rapid rise of China here and its rapid and quick merge in the last few years of becoming a near peer economic competitor to the United States. When we're talking about the rise of China, it's raw GDP, but it's also in terms of trade relationships. So this data from the Lowy Institute and the IMF is very important. Here we have a list of countries in 1980 of who is more reliant on the United States or China for trade. In 1980, US dominated system. Over 80% of countries traded with the United States more than they did with China. But just a few years later, by 2000, we see China building out. And so that by 2018, that number had dropped sharply to just 30% of countries that trade more with the United States than they do with China. And as China has swiftly taken the top position in 128 of 190 countries. And it's also military power, the rise of China, in that China has been making steadily increasing investments in its defense budget. We have the official state budget as well as external estimates of their spending, which are not only fielding more capabilities, but also more advanced capabilities. And the charts on the right, the red columns being fourth generation or modern capabilities. So it's a force that's modernizing quite rapidly and building what in the West we call an anti-access area denial capability, what the Chinese refer to as a counter-intervention strategy, which is tailored to prevent the United States from intervening in some of China's more potentially close conflicts, be it with Japan, be it on the Korean Peninsula, be it with Taiwan or in the South China Sea. The idea is to try to deter the United States, and if not deter, then deny, delay, degrade the ability of the United States to intervene in those contingencies. But this leads to, I think, a key question about China. What does China want? What are they trying to do? What are they trying to accomplish? And there was an announcement at the Party Congress, this is an image of the Party Congress, announcing that China has entered a new era. And many understood that this was to be linked with Xi Jinping, the rise of Xi Jinping, but it was unclear for many about what this new era actually was. So in my conversations with some Chinese scholars and my readings, the best quote that I found was this comparison, that under Mao, China stood up, under Deng, China got rich, and under Xi Jinping, China will grow powerful. So China is looking to translate its power, its wealth and capabilities into greater geopolitical power. But that still doesn't really tell us what China wants. And of course, you can't just read the documents of what they say, because it's quite laden in obfuscation. So what the book says is that at its core, China is seeking what they call the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation, in which China is stable and prosperous at home, in which it has significant external power, which I'll get to in a moment. But for the United States, what's important to know is that this is a major power unlike anything we've seen before. And it's one of the reasons why old historical analogies don't work as well. That it's domestically motivated primarily. Its foreign affairs is still primarily motivated by its domestic issues. But its approach to foreign affairs is also shaped by the unique history of the Chinese Communist Party and that party's unique ideology. And it takes what I refer to as an exceptionalist approach to international order. And this is very different and distinct from what we refer to as American exceptionalism, which is based on the idea that the United States is a special country with a special role to play in the region because of our history, because of our ideology. China's, what I call Chinese exceptionalism, is not based on that sense, but rather it's more of a civilizational exceptionalism. That China's leaders, Chinese elites, believe that China is just a special country because of its history, because of its historically dominant position, its culture, the achievements of its past, and therefore believes that it needs to have exceptions to an international order beyond what any other country would believe. So what that means in practice is that China is not trying to explicitly tear down the international system. They're not trying to destroy the UN or destroy international organizations, but they are trying to reform it and change it to be more compatible with the interests and preferences of the Chinese Communist Party. So for the way that works, for example, is when it comes to freedom of navigation in international waters, that when countries like the United States operate their ships and aircraft in the South China Sea, China raises objections, saying that we're traveling in their spaces. Yet when Chinese ships do the same thing near islands controlled by Japan, or even the United States near the Aleutian Islands in Alaska, China does that with no problem, as is protected by international law. And the way they square that when I've asked them about this has been to say that they fully support freedom of navigation, that ships should be able to sail where they need in accordance with international law, but China is special, China has unique interests, and therefore we probably shouldn't do that in sensitive places like the South China Sea. That's an example of the exceptionalist approach that I talk about. And part of that is an implicit rejection of the sovereign equality of nations. Emphasis on the equality piece, that as some Chinese officials have in the past talked about, that there are strong countries and there are weak countries, and the strong countries should have an ability to do more of what they want than the weaker countries. And that gets at some of the heart of some of the founding norms of the established liberal order. So there's no real explicit vision for an international system that the Chinese at least have credibly put out, but the book tries to cobble one together by defining what I think China's objectives are. I mentioned before, stable and prosperous at home, in which China is at the center of an informal hierarchical system, similar to what the West used to refer to as a tributary system, but with 21st century characteristics, in which China is regionally dominant, globally influential. And there's a key term that I highlight in the book, Hebutong, which is a reference to a Confucian aphorism, but basically it means uniformity. It means that a man aims at uniformity and not at harmony. And what this translates to in practice is that in Beijing's view, China does not really need to explicitly dominate international relations, but only to ensure that the rest of the world can live in harmony with China as it pursues its interests. So as we've seen before, the Chinese ambassador to the United States, appearing on Fareed Zakaria's show, recently made a similar comment that China does not need to adapt to the world, it's the world that needs to adapt to China. So as I mentioned before, China will seek to adjust the international order to reflect the interests and needs of the Chinese Communist Party. And ultimately what that will mean is a revision, weakened and more compliant international laws and norms, and a circumscribed role for the United States in the Indo-Pacific. So this book takes a lot of views, spends a lot of time talking about the view from our allies and partners. To my mind, the middle powers are going to be a key battleground in US-China competition and will be very influential in the long-term health and success of a liberal order. So I wanted to spend some time talking about the view from our allies and partners, that they see China as economically important, but they do not support Chinese dominance. They're not on Team China necessarily because of their economic connectivity. They see, broadly speaking, I'll get into this in a bit, the United States positively, though they generally do not see President Trump positively. They do continue to look to the United States for leadership. They're uncomfortable with being in the middle of US-China competition, and they're especially uncomfortable with pressure to abandon a hedging strategy for explicit alignment. So one of the arguments that the book makes is to talk about the Indo-Pacific's emerging heterarchy, which is an overlaid mix of different hierarchies across different elements of national power. And it makes the argument that the United States and China are already starting to develop their own environments, their own, what the book calls functional spheres of influence across different areas of national power, be it trade communities, security mechanisms, technology standards, infrastructure, in which there's a Chinese version and an American version. And allies and partners and most middle powers, I expect, will look to each of those, both for measurements of which country is stronger in that particular area, but also which environment, which sphere of influence they're more likely to align with. And that many countries, I expect, will pick and choose in that they may find the China-centric trade community to be more attractive than the United States, since there really isn't an American equivalent to RCEP since we left TPP negotiations, but perhaps they want to be part of the security mechanisms that the United States offers, or technology standards because of privacy. So this is what competition, I expect, is going to look like in the 21st century. We're not talking about military competition like we saw in the Cold War, but rather a much more complex, integrated form of competition. And I think that leads to what the book refers to as complex hedging strategies. In that, of the four broad options that our allies and partners have, either bandwagoning with China, balancing externally either with or without the United States, or balancing internally, I expect that most of our allies and partners will actually pursue a mix of all four in order to maximize their flexibility, given the amount of uncertainty that they have, that they're facing. So talking about their views and the views of their public, the Pew Research put out some terrific surveys on how the world looks at the United States and China. And I won't go too much into the numbers. You can find it in the book, you can find it online. But broadly speaking, most of these countries, with a few exceptions, want to have good economic relations with both the United States and China. If not one or the other, it's always the United States. If it comes down to it, they prefer engaging with the United States than China, but prefer both. Similarly, as I mentioned before, they have low confidence, broadly speaking, in President Trump, although the Philippines is an exception. India is an exception a bit, but in some ways not doing as well as compared to Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping, depending on the country. But views of the United States are still pretty much quite strong across the region, and that they prefer American leadership uniformly over that of China. And this, to me, was the most important piece for us, for this discussion from the Pew Research, that when asking which countries do you expect to be more powerful in 10 years, and which country would you rather be the leading power, most countries expect that China will eventually become more powerful, but they still want to see the United States leading. And that has important implications that I'll get into in a bit. So putting it all together, their views of the United States is that they see us as a security provider, providing public goods that's in their interest, yet we're inconsistent, we're distant geographically, we're easily distracted to other issues, and there's questions about our relative capabilities, both in terms of military capabilities, but especially after COVID-19, the fundamental competence of our government. Whereas views of China, they see China primarily as an economic power that's self-interested, but is consistent in their engagement, that's close, that's focused, but there's also questions about the capabilities of its government, both its military and otherwise. So you hear a lot about the rise of China when people talk about Asia, and I've spent a lot of time on it. But one of the points the book makes is that we've also been seeing the rise of other countries in Asia, that it's not just China, it's not a Chinese century, it's an Asian century. And so this chart is a good example that other countries have been rising just as fast, if not faster, than China. Of course, they're not as large, India being an exception, but taken together, they represent significant geopolitical power. And so this book makes the argument that our allies and partners are strategic assets, and if taken together with American power, could be a tremendous asset in our efforts to compete with the Chinese and to shape the future of the international order. So the strategy that this book describes to empower allies and partners in the Indo-Pacific, the broad strokes of the strategy is really to identify three objectives: to counteract changes in the regional balance of power, to oppose Chinese exceptionalist objectives, and to revitalize a 21st century liberal order. Of course, all three of these are integrated really by doing two broad initiatives. One, to rebuild American geopolitical strength, and two, to empower our allies and partners. And for the purposes of the presentation, it's more detailed in the book. I'll talk about these four pieces of the framework about how I describe the United States going about this strategy. First, to revitalize liberal order for the 21st century. Now, as I mentioned, order in Asia is established and shaped by the balance of power. And so the United States not only needs to build its own power, but also the power of its allies and partners, and harness it in collective action. Basing it on liberal principles, common rules and norms, liberal economic systems, and adopting participatory democratic systems of government, while also developing new norms and laws and for emerging technologies, reforming old and building new international institutions, and enhancing governance and infrastructure. And this is part of the argument that things have changed. We can't just turn back the clock. We need to adapt for the future and adapt the liberal order to reflect changes to the world. Second, by empowering our allies and partners to contribute to a regional order and contribute to our efforts to compete with the Chinese. That means moving beyond the traditional hub and spoke approach to a more networked approach that encourages multilateral and multilateral cooperation, but also moving beyond security, conceiving of alliances as more than just military arrangements, but rather as platforms for cooperation and coordination across all elements of national power. And that network cooperation among like-minded nations working together towards shared interests can help revitalize this order and compete with China. It also talks about revitalizing American power at home, such as increasing participation in international institutions, engaging multilaterals, deploying more diplomats, foreign military assistance. It makes a key argument about governance and fighting corruption that not only does that have important normative effects, but it also closes doors of opportunity that the Chinese can exploit to expand their own influence. There's a lot spent on enhancing US military capabilities and as well as the capabilities of our allies and partners, and the need to tailor some of those capabilities to meet the needs of some partners and allies that are less developed and have fewer resources. They also have different needs than what we have. And finally, it means reconceiving of our competition with China. As I mentioned before, being clear that we're competing over power and order, that we're seeking to preserve that liberal order by emphasizing values and the quality of our engagement, by offering a compelling alternative to the Chinese systems and initiatives. Too long, I think, when the Chinese have come up with new initiatives, be it the Belt and Road Initiative or other efforts, or 5G and Huawei, for example, too often the American response has been to just shout no. And that's insufficient for competition. We need compelling alternatives that when we're talking to our allies and partners, that we can point them to. That's compelling, that's affordable, that's sustainable, and that's how we compete. And I call it in the book, the confidence to compete, to not harp on our allies and partners, to choose sides that everything is a test of their loyalty and of our alliance, but rather to have these countries understand that these countries have difficult choices to make and make our best case for why engaging with the United States is in their interest. Because I have the confidence that our system, our capabilities, our people are more attractive ultimately than anything the Chinese can offer. So finally, the final arguments for the book, that we can't return to the way things were before, that we have to address the region for what it is, but we're still positioned, I think, best in the world to lead, certainly more than the Chinese, but we're not going to be able to do it alone. That if we don't follow this, the book makes the argument, if we don't follow this approach, that we have alternative paths, that be it ever expanding unilateralism, where our foreign policy becomes increasingly unsustainable financially, where we just pull back and have a diminished role for the United States, or our leadership becomes increasingly hollow. So to close, I use a motto that I hear a lot from Silicon Valley. It's also the Moneyball motto: adapt or die. And I think that's a good, maybe a bit overdramatic approach for the United States going forward, that we need to adapt, that it's certainly in our capabilities to adapt. And hopefully this book offers some ideas and suggestions on how we could adapt to keep ourselves relevant and powerful in the region. So I'll stop there and invite my friend and former Pentagon colleague, Kelly Magsamen from Center for American Progress, to ask questions, make comments, and we'll have a discussion for 15, 20 minutes. So Kelly.
Well, first of all, it's wonderful to be here with all of you, and especially with my good friend and former partner in crime at the Pentagon, Abe Denmark. We did a lot of trouble, got in good trouble, I think, during our years there. But first of all, congratulations on a very important and timely contribution to scholarship on the Asia-Pacific, and in particular, what the role of the United States should be in tandem with its allies and partners. And so I know this has been a long-term project for you, and so I'm really excited to see it come to fruition finally at such a really important moment, I think, in the world and in the ever-evolving relationships that you just described. But maybe I'll start with one area where I know you have a lot of experience, which is alliance management. We did a lot of this in the Pentagon together at a really fun time right after the US-Japan defense guidelines were updated, for example. But I really want to just get at the core of what, you think when you spoke earlier about, the sort of history of the US-Japan alliance. It got me thinking, what is the future of these kinds of alliance relationships? You talk in the book a little bit about calling them sort of comprehensive platforms for cooperation, that they've been largely over-militarized. I think we all think that, I think many of us in this space believe that these alliance relationships could use a little bit of updating in many respects. And so I'm just curious, there's a lot of debate, especially in the now and during the Trump administration, about burden sharing and the importance of allies stepping up. So I just want to get your perspective on what is the future of these relationships, and where do we go from here in terms of how we think about allies in the context of the Asia Pacific?
Sure. Well, thanks, Kelly. It's great to see you. Thanks so much for doing this. As you know, alliance management is a mix of setting lofty expectations, having great ideas, and then figuring out the drudgery of actually accomplishing them, which can often be a slow and difficult process. And what it's interesting. Coming out of this project, coming out of the Pentagon, this book had been a bit half written already. And one of the things I learned, I realized when I came out, one is that I had to rewrite it because of all I learned in the Pentagon. But also then the Trump administration came in and they were asking, I think, even more fundamental questions about the roles of our alliances. So I think that the headline to answer your question from this book is that we need to think big, that there's sort of the piecemeal sausage making of alliance management that we need to do, be it resolving special measures agreements and host nation support agreements, figuring out basing issues and all of that. But really taking a step back and really thinking big about what it is that we're actually trying to accomplish. And by pointing to order and power, by pointing to China competition, but also pointing to the fact that our alliances make decisions based on their own interests, not out of enough haranguing from the United States, that when our allies and partners want to do more, when they agree to do more, it's because they believe it's in their interest to do more. And so we need to be able to offer that compelling alternative, being more cooperation, more significant capabilities, more resources, and then really challenging them to step up. On the military sphere, that means, I think it means looking at posture, looking at investments, joint development of capabilities. It means exercises and experimentation on asymmetric capabilities and approaches, but also beyond the military sphere, I think it means coordinating on issues of diplomacy, coordinating our approach in international institutions, working on how those institutions may need to be reformed, building new norms, those sorts of things, and really keeping our allies in on the ground floor. So, and I'll stop on this last point. For those of us who work on defense issues, who look at US-China competition, there's been a lot of talk about the United States needing to develop new technologies, investing in new asymmetric capabilities. Now, one of the points the book makes is that our allies and partners, some of them have real assets here. They have a lot to add. And so for our efforts to maintain our technological edge, we need to bring our allies and partners, some of them, we need to bring them in on the ground floor at the conceptual level and think about how we can work with them on developing technologies, fielding technologies, so that it's not just a US effort to maintain a technological advantage, but rather it's a US plus Japan, plus Australia, plus et cetera. And because of that, we get their expertise, we get their resources, and I expect we'll be able to make more progress more quickly if we're able to bring them in on the ground floor rather than as a third or fourth order priority.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. One of the things that late in the Obama administration that we worked on together was the sort of concept of networking those alliance relationships, which is even harder in some cases because those countries have their own interests and their own politics. You can look at the relationship among the Quad, for example, of India, Australia, Japan, and the United States. Sometimes it's on, sometimes it's off. As you're looking ahead to networking as a concept, is it still relevant as a concept? Is it more relevant today or less? And what do you kind of see as the next wave of that networking?
No, I think that's a great question. There's a lot of network. I think we need to first get back to where we were in terms of the minilaterals that had been working, especially between Japan and Korea, which is really taken a backslide in the last few years, but also building on some of the good work of that's already happened, like the Quad, which is a fascinating development. And it's not in the book, but in the meetings that I've had of Quad members, think tankers from the Quad countries, I've found that we spend a lot of time talking about how we're not an anti-China alliance, but then we talk about doing a lot of things that the Chinese probably wouldn't like. But those are the sorts of things that I think we could be doing and building on. And I think there's a lot of opportunity there beyond sort of the Quad and the US-China, the US-Japan, Korea. I would look at including more countries like Singapore, potentially, other countries from Southeast Asia, Vietnam, into some exercises, especially exercises like Malabar, but also integrating more of European countries. The French and the UK especially are interested in playing more of a significant role. In my book, I have this sort of thought experiment about what a multinational carrier strike group would look like, with American submarines, a Japanese carrier, Australian planes, and just thinking about maybe making that a stretch goal of having this multinational carrier group put together sailing through international waters would be a tremendous statement, and something that I think at some point should be within our grasp. So to me, it's building on the foundations of what we have and then going deeper and broader.
That's great. Which maybe brings me to my next question, which is really about US defense posture. As we all know, we're living in a very interesting world right now, and post-COVID or ongoing COVID environment. I think we all agree that defense budgets are probably going to come down in the near future. And what does that mean when you're thinking about posture in the Pacific competing with China? The difference between being able to deter versus defeat versus, just having what is, militarily necessary to manage those challenges. How do you think about U.S. posture in the framework that you laid out in your book?
Yeah, it's a terrific question. Actually, my follow-on project to the book is a study with some of our former Pentagon colleagues on posture. So some of these ideas are still in development. But I think that there needs to be a fresh look at US posture across the Indo-Pacific, in that the threat from China, as well as from North Korea, has evolved significantly. But also we have access to different technologies and different capabilities than we've had since the last time we did a comprehensive review of posture. So developing, working with our allies and partners to develop a new approach to posture that's more distributed, capable of operating in austere environments, I think is important. There's a few efficiencies that we could find. There are a lot of people in the Navy who actually say that the operational tempo has been unsustainable. Is one of the reasons why there have been so many incidents with the Navy over the last few years, fires and whatnot. And I think part of that is that we're doing presence operations, which are very important. We're showing our presence in a very inefficient way, in that if we need to show that the United States can fly, sail, or operate in a specific area, it's much cheaper in terms of the platform cost, but also operations and maintenance cost to send a smaller, cheaper ship through that place than a huge carrier strike group. And so finding a way to do those sorts, to maintain presence in a more efficient way with our allies and partners, but also with the Coast Guard, with smaller, cheaper platforms, would be a way to maintain presence without breaking the bank. The challenge I think that we're going to find, and this is especially true in the gray zone challenges, is that concepts of deterrence, reassurance, and presence are fairly intermixed, in that presence is a deterrent to a degree. But all the capabilities in the world, all the presence in the world is not going to make up enough of another key aspect of deterrence that's pretty much impossible to demonstrate until things happen, which is will. And Michelle Flournoy is talking about this, that we need to also be able to demonstrate will. And that's not so much, to me, a question of technology or posture even, but it's a question of presence, and it's a question of whether or not we're willing to tolerate a degree of risk and a degree of turbulence. And that, I think, is not something that you can invest in, but rather it's more of a political and strategic shift that comes from leadership. And that's something that I think we still need, that we're still looking to see how that actually works, especially in a more budget constrained environment, the way you described.
I'm going to ask you a hard question.
Okay.
and it's hard. And the reason I say it's hard is because it's something that you and I worked a lot on and poured a lot of our heart and soul into, which is the issues around the South China Sea. And to get to your point about will versus just capability, when you're looking at the situation in the South China Sea today, is it lost? Is it over? Have the Chinese essentially prevailed? If not, what is the strategy going forward, addressing all the same, questions that we just discussed about the importance of presence, but yet presence is also challenging and costly on a number of levels, doesn't necessarily shift the dynamic at all. So what do you see as the way forward on South China Sea, and how do you think things are currently in the region on that?
Yeah, I think that there's, I definitely don't think that it's been lost. I don't think that the Chinese have prevailed, but a lot of it will depend on how we define what our objectives are. If we define our objectives as the Chinese don't build anything in the South China Sea, then I think that's one, it's not a great objective, because I don't know what that accomplishes, other than the satisfaction of saying that they're not building anything. But it doesn't really speak to our interests. And it's one of the reasons why my book talks a lot about order. Because to me, the key pieces of the South China Sea, a lot of it has to deal with order and with power, that the United States is able to continue to operate. And one of the things that I liked about freedom of navigation operations, why I think they're important, and just US presence in the South China Sea, is that it sends a signal to the Chinese and to our allies and partners, which is basically, to me, sending a signal that you guys are going to build this stuff on these islands, but it's not going to change who we are, it's not going to change what we do, and it's not going to change our principles. And so to me, that's a form of deterrence by denial, that it's showing that we're not going to be intimidated by building some islands and putting some stuff on them. To me, we need to be clear about what we're trying to accomplish in the South China Sea, maintaining freedom of navigation, defending our alliances. To me, those have been relatively accomplished, but there's a lot more that we need to do in terms of building our alliance with the Philippines, especially, which is difficult, of course, with Duterte, but doing as much as we can there while we can, but also improving our relations with some of the other claimants, Vietnam, Singapore, Malaysia, potentially Indonesia, building those capabilities as best we can, building those relationships as best we can, but also, and this is a part where I think the Obama administration that we served in made a bit of a strategic error, and it's arguable, but the tribunal ruling that came out during the Obama administration, to me, is a legal basis for a more principled approach to the South China Sea that shows that it's not just the United States pushing back, but really it's the international community, and that China's actions are not consistent with international law. And the Trump administration has picked that up, at least rhetorically, and has endorsed it. And I think that that's part of an approach that helps us, again, sustain an order based on established laws and norms, and can be the foundation for efforts to push back against China. Now, I don't think we're going to convince the Chinese one way or another to withdraw from the South China Sea, but you and I both had a hand in putting together the statement that Secretary Carter would make a lot, that continued into the Trump administration, that the United States will fly, sail, and operate wherever international law allows. To me, that's a critical statement of intent, of principle, and something that we should never let any country, let alone the Chinese, have a say. I think that's how we move ahead. I know it's not a great answer. It doesn't solve it.
It's a tough one.
There's one last point. I'm sorry. There's one last point that I would make, is that FONOPs are not sufficient to address this. Military is not sufficient to do this, that it's going to require a whole of government approach that involves diplomacy, that involves economic statecraft, that involves information. The Chinese have an all of government approach to that, and we're not going to be able to address it until we use all of our government to increase the cost of the Chinese for malicious behavior, but also to build the capabilities of our allies and partners in order to be able to assert their own interests, to defend themselves, and to work with us more effectively to understand what's happening and to make sure that they have the ability to assert their interests and their rights the same way that any other country, including the United States, has as well. And that's, I know it's a long answer, but I think that's where I'll stop.
Yeah, I agree. I think, you know, I want to come back a little bit to the China question. And you worked a lot on sort of China mill conversations, engagement, especially over, you know, confidence building measures with respect to air and maritime safety, and those kinds of, the importance of those kinds of channels being in place. Where do you see the future of US-China mill engagement dialogue? Is it worth it? Is it still important? Should it be done differently? Kind of what is your, especially as we head into a much more competitive phase, what's your outlook on that issue?
Yeah, I think mill is important, but I think you need to be careful in your military engagements with the Chinese. And we need to be very clear about what we're trying to accomplish and what we're not trying to accomplish. That I think for some, there's an instinct to engage the Chinese for the sake of engaging the Chinese, just having those talks and having those contacts. And in my experience, both in the Obama administration, but even in the Bush administration before that, is that those sorts of things don't tend to work very well with the Chinese. You need to have those meetings, but at some point, you need to make sure that you're able to accomplish something. And you do that by sticking to your principles. Now, you mentioned the confidence building measures that we conducted. I think they're important. I think they made some progress, but they're not a solution. They're part of a puzzle. Military diplomacy can be an effective tool. I think it's a necessary tool. We had military diplomacy going on with the Soviet Union during the Cold War. So it's certainly something that we should be able to accomplish. But I think it needs to be evaluated from the ground up in terms of what do we want to accomplish, making sure that we have the right connections in place, that quite often our military connections they're not talking to the right people, in that the head of our Navy doesn't have the same job as the head of their Navy, for example. So sort of reevaluating who's talking to who, making sure we're clear about what we're trying to accomplish. But there's a last point that I would make, and it's true for the mill, but it's also true, I think, for all aspects of engagement and cooperation with the Chinese, in that the Chinese are very good at figuring out what our priorities are, what do we really want, and then holding those things somewhat hostage to what they want. So that for example, they'll say, we know you want to cooperate with us on North Korea, but how can we cooperate with you on North Korea if you're still selling arms to Taiwan or meeting with the Dalai Lama or whatever it may be? And the key there is that we have to maintain our principles and stick to our interests, that we can engage with them in the mill. We need to talk to them about strategic stability, about nuclear issues, about conventional deterrence, about the South China Sea, about North Korea, all those things we need to talk to them about, but not to the detriment of our ability to engage with our allies, to defend ourselves, defend our allies, and to compete with the Chinese as we need to. So to me, it's all part of an integrated whole.
That's great. Well, congratulations again, Abe, on a fantastic and important piece of work that is now, I encourage everyone to buy it on Amazon, but I'm going to turn over the question and answer segment now to a good friend as well, Dr. Ashley Tellis.
Thanks so much, Kelly. It's great to see you.
Well, thank you, Kelly. It's wonderful to be here, and it's great to see you, Abe, as well, and all the other friends. I haven't seen Bob Litvak in years, and I suspect he's somewhere at the end of this electronic chain, at least listening in. First, let me start by congratulating you, Abe. It was really wonderful to read the manuscript, which I did a few days ago. And what I was struck by was your effort to talk about order in the broadest sense, obviously, but to anchor it very much in power, because at the end of the day, order is not exactly epiphenomenal, but without power, it's hard to sustain that order, certainly in ways that would advance our interests. And so the fact that you started out with the discussion of order, but then anchored it in questions of power, I thought really made the analysis worthwhile and give it staying power, because it's much harder to change distributions of power than people think, even though the order can be buffeted by short-term foreign policy decisions by the various actors. As long as the underlying distributions of power are sort of robust and enduring, it gives us hope that we can resuscitate even damaged portions of the order, assuming you get leadership that is enlightened and leadership that is sort of far thinking in place. And I know we will have an opportunity in the next few months to sort of re-examine some of these issues for our own country, and I hope we choose wisely. I want to make one basic point, which I thought actually was underlying your analysis, but risks being lost because of your focus on change. And then I have two broader sets of questions that I want to explore with you. The basic underlying point that I think is really important to keep in mind is that despite all the changes in Asia in the last 30 odd years, I think it is still an American-dominated order that defines the landscape in the broadest sense of the Indo-Pacific. And that, of course, leads to the conclusion that it is also ours to lose. That is because it is our order, and that order, I think, has still survived. Depending on the choices we make, we could lose that order. And so that really is something that is important to keep in mind, that the Chinese have not displaced us by any means. And even though our geopolitical structures are constantly being challenged by China, I'm actually amazed at how much they have endured. The alliances are still in relatively decent shape, despite the efforts of President Trump. Even the alliance with Korea, which I think is at greatest risk compared to all our other bilateral alliances in Asia, has survived to this day. And if we have a change in November, then we actually have the opportunity to sort of rethink and rebuild some of these alliances. So I think the geopolitical foundations, although buffeted, have still survived, and that's a good thing. When you look at the economy, I think the story is actually just as robust. I think we made a strategic mistake walking out of the TPP in a way that President Trump did. And even then candidate Clinton obviously was very uncomfortable with TPP, more for political reasons than really hard economic reasons. But US engagement in the economies of Asia, particularly with respect to investment, is still very strong. Now, I think a simple gravitational model of trade would predict that China will remain the largest trader in the region with respect to sort of goods, merchandise trade. But we can more than stand our own with respect to investment and with respect to invisibles. And so even though China is sort of creating inevitably an Asian economic system that is deeply linked with China, it's not going to be to the exclusion of the United States. And if, as you argue in the book, we come back and rejoin TPP in some form, then we are back in the economic game. We're back in the economic game. Of course, we'll have to make some decisions about how much integration in Asia we want to see ourselves sustain, because there are now new questions about competition with China and so on and so forth. But I don't think we've lost out even on the economic side. In a paradoxical way, despite having the strongest military, I think the relative changes have been greatest in the military arena, because China has acquired the capability to hold our power projection capabilities at risk. And unless we can claw back our space for more effective power projection, the foundations on which the geopolitical system and the economic system have been constructed in Asia, will be in peril. And so that is something, obviously, that I hope the next administration, will sort of accelerate. To the credit of this administration, they've actually begun to put the pieces in place for clawing back power projection, but we are nowhere near, the task is nowhere near complete. So that is, so all this is a long-winded way of basically saying that the US should not be ruled out of the game, and that we still have a fairly formidable presence that, if coupled with wise leadership and a certain degree of benevolence, actually would, take us exactly to where you would like to see us be in terms of your broader book. So I have, with that as a sort of baseline, I have three broad questions, and I'll lay out the questions and then we can sort of discuss them in further detail in turn. The first question I have is, your book comes at the tail end of really a very successful 30-year run for China in terms of its economic expansion. But as I look out 30 years hence, I wonder whether you would have similar conclusions if you were to write this book 30 years from now. Because it seems to me that we are seeing the tail end of Chinese success and China's ability to throw its weight around, growing from that economic success. But if one looks at the current trends, a slowing Chinese economy, a coming demographic transition, China still unable to break out of, the low/middle income trap and move into the levels of high per capita incomes. And now a, quite significant US-China trade war, which, even if the worst elements don't survive Trump, the elements of technology control, of constraining China's easy access to international markets, et cetera, will all continue to remain in place, even under a Biden administration. And so if one were to look at China 30 years from now, what kind of a power do you anticipate it would be? And would the challenges that you have, I think, correctly highlighted in the volume today be the challenges that survive? Or in some sense, would China then end up just being a transitional problem rather than a permanent problem? I know this is beyond the scope of the book, but I wanted to ask if you might sort of engage that question. Because if we really believe that China is not eternally fated to be on a perpetual rise, then the way we think about some of the issues you've raised in the book also begin to change. And so I wanted to just put that out there and see if I could sort of trigger a reaction or, force some kind of a response.
Sure. Well, first, thank you so much, Ashley, for participating in this. It's wonderful to see you. I don't think I've seen you since you grew your beard, but I don't think you saw me since I grew my beard. So I think that shows how long it's been. Wonderful to see you. Thank you so much for doing this. In answer to first, in reaction to your comments, I think that there's going to be some terrific PhD dissertations written in the coming years about the resilience of US alliances and partnerships, because they've been really put through the ringer to a degree in the last few years, and they're still there. And so I think maybe some John Eikenberry acolytes will be writing some dissertations about this in the coming years. But I agree, and I say in the book, I think the United States is still poised to lead, and we're in the best position to lead. If we think about the future power distribution, the future of order, I do not believe that a China-centric China-led order is really a realistic outcome, even though I think that's what the Chinese are trying to accomplish, in that there's very little interest across the region for a Chinese-centric leadership. If anything, to me, the alternative to a US-led liberal order is really an order that is much more atomized, more chaotic, more anarchic than it was before, similar to Europe in the 19th century and before, rather than a Chinese neo-tributary system, despite their ambitions. To answer your question about what will China look like in 30 years, the book actually does address China's weaknesses. It's like you can't talk about China's strengths, you can't talk about what China may be if you don't address its very significant challenges. And I'd always say I would much rather be an American official working on China than a Chinese official working on the United States. Ours is a much easier job. And it's one of the reasons I make the argument that China's foreign policy is still very much domestically driven, because their domestic challenges are so much more significant than their international challenges. And it's something that they recognize and acknowledge. Their economy is slowing. They've been expecting a slowing economy for a long time. In fact, there's some analysis that one of the reasons Xi Jinping was selected and allowed to accrue so much power was because of expectations of a slowing economy and the resulting uncertainties and political challenges that would bring. I think China will continue to face the challenges that they're having in terms of not being an attractive power, not being able to break out of the middle income track, not being a great source or place for investment because of the political challenges inherent to the system, and that no predictability, no rule of law, no belief, no real potential that a business or an investment can operate free of political pressure from the Chinese Communist Party. And if they were to start implementing those reforms, that would threaten the party itself in terms of rule of law, diminishing the role of the party. But what I think is important to acknowledge is that this is a challenge that the Chinese are very much aware of. And I'll close with this little anecdote. I was having a conversation about these very issues with the Chinese official several years ago, and talking about how as a middle class grows, they're going to want more input in what's happening in their system. They're going to want more freedom from government and party interference, rule of law, et cetera, et cetera. And as I was going through this, the Chinese official stopped me and said, are you really trying to explain the revolutionary potential of the middle class to a Marxist? So this is something that they're very much aware of. In terms of what China will look like 30 years from now, I have no idea. It does raise questions about whether or not this is a long-term challenge or a short-term challenge. What my answer to that is that China has 1.3 billion people. It has nuclear weapons. It has a very capable military. It's not going away. That if China's political system changes, then it would represent a different challenge, potentially more of a humanitarian and development challenge rather than a strategic challenge, but it would still be a challenge. I think that major power competition is not going away. Those who may have thought that it had during our unipolar moment, I think were either ignoring developments or focused on the wrong pieces. But to me, the real question is the sustainability of the Chinese Communist Party and their ability to sort of keep everything together and their ability to translate the tremendous potential of the Chinese people into actual national power. You've written on the ability of states to translate potential into real power. And I think they still face a lot of those challenges. It's one of our advantages. But I think overall, they're a major challenge now. I think for the foreseeable future, they're a major challenge. And whatever happens, I don't think they're going to go away.
Can I follow up on that? It's unfair to sort of ask you to predict what China is going to be 30 years now, and I ask that more as a provocation than as a question that, you know, would have a detailed answer. But it seems to me that China has grown so far, basically because it's had unfettered access to the global economic system. And your book brings that out really nicely as to how China exploited those opportunities. But if one looks even in the near term, say the next 5 to 10 years, and sees China's external economic engagement as being compressed because of fears on the part of other countries, the two substitutions that are available to China are essentially expansion into its near abroad, which is what the Belt and Road in some ways is attempting to do, and transitioning from export-led growth to the expansion of a domestic market. In fact, if China wants to reach the levels of high per capita incomes, it would have to do domestic market expansion anyway. Right. Based on your sort of assessment of China, both in the book and beyond the book, what do you think are the prospects for success on both these counts? The BRI as a sustainable alternative that actually provides real returns to China as opposed to just being a device for influence peddling in Eurasia, and the prospects for a real transition to a domestic economy, which the Chinese have advertised has been around the corner, you know, for now several years. But I'm just not sure what its prospects are. So if you could sort of just speak to those two, would indirectly answer some of the longer term questions.
Sure. In terms of BRI, there's still a lot of questions from external analysts about what BRI actually is. My favorite description has been a highly coordinated and highly centralized marketing campaign surrounding a highly uncoordinated and decentralized efforts at investment and business opportunity and business activity. There's certainly a strategic aspect to it for Beijing to build economic connectivity. In the book, I actually talk about why China especially sees a link between economic connectivity and geopolitical alignment. It goes into Marxist theory that I bore my Georgetown University students about, but I won't bore this audience about, in terms of communist orthodoxy. But they seem to be convinced that this is a path to power by building economic dependency. I don't think it's going to work. So far, the information seems to suggest that countries that are economically tied to the Chinese, at least in terms of trade, but are large enough to have their own economic market and their own some degree of geopolitical power, those are the countries that are most concerned about China's rise. Countries like South Korea, for example, some countries in Southeast Asia. The more dependent on China they grow economically, the more concerned they grow about China strategically. So BRI, I think, is going to be an important part of China's efforts to project themselves as a country on the move, a country that's focused, a country that's trying to help other countries develop the normative aspect of their soft power campaign. Whether or not it's sustainable, I think is an economic question. Whereas I think ultimately BRI is a political endeavor, not an economic endeavor. Economically, is it sustainable? Probably not. I'd say most of those projects weren't happening before because they didn't make economic sense. But if they make strategic sense, and if they're being done for strategic reasons, then it may still be a success, even if it doesn't make any money, or even if it loses money. But I also don't believe that it's actually going to translate into geopolitical alignment, except for countries that really have no other alternative. Like Cambodia, for example. To get at your, I'm trying to remember the second part of your question. I can't write them down and listen to you at the same time. You're muted. Sorry.
Oh, no, the question of the transition to domestic consumption, building an internal market.
So the Chinese economists that I've talked to liken China today to the United States in the 1880s. After the Civil War, the United States was able to become a great power, in large part because of its own internal development. It had this huge area that wasn't open, but it hadn't been taken by people of European descent. And so they had saw a lot of opportunity for economic development, building the railroads and whatnot. And the Chinese see a lot of the same thing. I think the problem that they have is that I don't think China is even close to analogous to where the United States was in the 1880s. There's still a lot that they can build in terms of China, but it would take pretty fundamental changes to China's economic and political system that they find to be untenable in terms of reducing the role of state-owned enterprises, allowing markets to thrive. I mean, the Wild West was wild for a reason, and it's not something that the Chinese would tolerate. So I don't see it. I think that it would take either a long time or pretty significant structural changes inside of China. And they will need access to the international market. The question, though, is I think COVID, as well as concerns about Huawei, have really opened a lot of eyes around the world to the dangers and implications of getting too close to the Chinese. But the question to me is, do those market forces eventually force the Chinese to change part of their approach to a degree where they're at least, if not a trusted economic partner, then maybe a not distrusted partner. But again, I think that would take some pretty tough decisions from Beijing that at this point they haven't been willing to make.
Thanks, Abe. I thought that was extremely helpful because it makes me even more hopeful for our ability to sustain the kind of order in the Indo-Pacific that your book describes as valuable. I'm very conscious of the time, but I want to put, on the sort of table two questions for you, and these go sort of beyond China. The first has to do with the issue of alliances and networked alliances, something that Kelly raised in the last few minutes of her intervention. And I'll tell you, I like the idea intuitively, but there is also a certain skepticism that I have about the notion for the following reason. I think alliances matter at the end of the day because they are singularly concerned about collective defense. All parties essentially have some kinds of obligations with respect to the common defense. I'm trying to understand how one could replicate that in the bilateral context in Asia, since we have a hub and spoke system today, to something that is more genuinely networked. Now, in Europe, as you know, the network notion is natural because NATO is a collective defense system and there are near symmetrical obligations on the part of all the partners to defense. US alliances in Asia are highly asymmetrical. I mean, we are committed to defending our partners. They are not obliged to come to our defense in any circumstance. So the networking problem, it seems to me, runs into two challenges. And I was wondering if you could address both those. They work first best in peacetime or in near crises. But whether one can realize their full potential in war is still an open question. Two, given the character of the partnerships we have in Asia, whether we can actually create a genuinely networked system beyond Japan and Australia. Japan and Australia are the only two countries that I could imagine could become network partners of the United States in wartime, assuming the politics permits it, right? Which is a big question. Politics in those countries, whether that permits it, it's a big question. What would be the future of networking beyond Japan and Australia? And even where Japan and Australia are concerned, I mean, will the politics in those countries permit them to seamlessly operate with the United States if their interests are not directly attacked? So in other words, how do we create a network system in Asia that comes sort of closer, even if only sort of asymptotically, to the NATO ideal of an attack on one requires a response from all?
Yeah. It's a terrific question. I've actually been exploring these sorts of comparisons between how alliances in Asia were compared to with NATO. And you're right, they're very different. There's good reasons why they're different. And the book does not call for the US to recreate NATO or get as close as we can to NATO. I think they're very different. There's a reason I use the term network rather than multilateral or collective self-defense, in that I'm not trying to call for example, for Japan and Australia to become allies, or for Japan and Korea to become allies, or to make some sort of collective self-defense commitment, but rather to encourage them to work together on issues of mutual interest, that it's something above a partnership but below an alliance, so that you can imagine the hub and spoke with the dark lines on the hub and the hub and spoke, and maybe the lighter lines or dash lines connecting them. Beyond Japan and Australia, I think to me the number one would be Japan and Korea. I worked on that relationship a lot, especially with Deputy Secretary of State Tony Blinken. And he had his regular meetings with his Korean and Japanese counterparts. And since then, I've actually studied how that dynamic works, and I think there's more that can be done there. But to me, and I talk about this in the book, that other countries in the region have some advantages in terms of engaging other countries, potential partners in the region. For example, Australia has different kinds of baggage that they carry when they operate in the Southeast Asia than the United States. Japan has access, can do things that the United States can't do in parts of Southeast Asia. New Zealand can do things in the Pacific Islands that the United States can't. So in many ways, it's working with those countries, not even on military issues, not to try to replicate military issues, but on issues of infrastructure, development assistance, diplomatic coordination, towards a similar purpose. So it's not bringing us closer to NATO, but it is bringing us closer to more of a networked approach that maintains sort of the skeleton of hub and spokes, those sort of irreplaceable alliance relationships that you mentioned, that I completely agree, they're unlike anything else. But I do think that the connections between Japan and the Philippines, for example, or the cooperation that we've been seeing between Japan and India on infrastructure development in Southeast Asia and South Asia and in Africa, I think brings value and opens doors that the United States can't open by itself. And that to me is the value of a networked approach. And in crises, and when it comes to competition with China, when it comes to building a liberal order, it's promulgating those principles, operating as a building acts, be it a development assistance or building infrastructure on liberal principles of transparency and rule of law. But even on that, in terms of direct competition with China, it presents the Chinese with a much more complex geopolitical question, that when they are deciding they're going to accept some risk and upset one of their neighbors, the ramifications and ripples of that decision becomes much more difficult and complicated for them in a networked arena rather than a hub and spoke arena. I think Rob is signaling that he wants to jump in, but Ashley, thank you so much for coming in. It's wonderful to see you. I hope you're doing well. I hope to see you in person soon once science allows it.
Pleasure. I hope to see all of you in person soon, but I will stay on because I want to hear what Rob has to say as well.
Well,
great. Thanks, Ashley.
Thank you so much, Ashley and Kelly, for your contribution to today's sessions. Abe, this is such a rich analysis and so much to delve into. I mean, one area that I think is sort of requiring, future research is your points about complex hedging strategies, because it's really sort of a continuum of possible relationships. And I think it's really going to require very deft handling by a US administration to manage these different portfolios in a way, and to prevent, in IR terminology that you had in the book, that our allies will conclude that bandwagoning, that is cutting the best deal they can in Beijing, is better than dealing with the US. And I'm encouraged listening to the Asia experts we have on the panel today with you, Abe, that even though the Trump administration is they self-proclaim that they're disruptors, that actually the bedrock is sort of holding of what these alliance relationships are. And I think that's a very encouraging thing. I had a couple of reactions to your manuscript, which is, so rich. One is, and I can't resist, because my doctoral dissertation was on the Nixon Doctrine, and which was written in an earlier era when the United States was disengaging from the region, having fought the second of two wars in that region, where President Nixon was seeking to establish a different type of, in a sense, to devolve security responsibility to local allies. This is before the economic boom had really taken off in Asia, as a way to cover for US retrenchment. And I'm wondering, do you see any echoes of that era with what we're going through now, taking into account that the economics of it have changed dramatically?
Yeah, I think there's a danger of that. And it's a point that I make very explicitly in the book, in that we cannot approach, to me, I think the Nixon Doctrine is a lesson for this sort of a strategy, in that we cannot approach strategies to build our allies and partners' capabilities and to encourage them to do more. We can't approach that as a supplement to American power or as a cover for American retrenchment or withdrawal, which is what the Nixon Doctrine was, especially covering for the withdrawal from Vietnam. And we saw, as a result of that, some countries seeing the United States disengagement and deciding to begin their own indigenous nuclear programs, which to me points to, as I was mentioning with Ashley, that to me, the alternative to a US-led order is not a Chinese-led order, but rather a more atomized approach. And I think that's what the Nixon Doctrine was developing. So this strategy makes very clear that building American power, building American influence in the region has to accompany efforts to empower our allies and partners for just that reason. That we need to show our allies that we're not leaving, our allies and partners and our adversaries, that we're not leaving, that we remain engaged, that we're actually doubling down, and that as part of that effort to double down, we're going to be working with them so that they can do more as well. That to me is the main distinction between these. I'm, as you mentioned in my introduction, I'm a senior fellow in the Kissinger Institute. I haven't actually had a chance to talk about this with Dr. Kissinger yet, but I do think it's a critical difference. And the other piece of it that I do mention in the book is that we need to be careful with any of these sorts of strategies to think about and plan for unintended consequences. And so when I talk about building the capabilities of our allies and partners and giving them access to more capabilities, especially in the military realm, I talk about being selective and being careful about that, because we may think that we're giving some country defense capabilities, maritime defense capabilities to protect against Chinese coercion, but they may decide to use it against their neighbor. And what we don't want to be doing is to be facilitating an arms race in Southeast Asia or whatever. So being careful about who we're engaging with, what we're providing with them, making sure that it's stabilizing rather than destabilizing capabilities, I think is another aspect of thinking through the unintended consequences of a strategy. And I think, at least I hope, that the strategy I put together takes both the Nixon Doctrine and other potential unintended consequences into account to make sure that we're doing this in a thoughtful and careful way.
Well, thank you. It's a brilliant, if I may say, tour de force, Abe, that you've done there, and for station identification, popularly priced on Amazon.com. Please find Abe's book. But I want to ask one other. It's really kind of extending the analysis of your book. I'm struck by how much you had in the book, and Ashley sort of picked up on this, about how much is in there about order and China's role in the order. You were channeling a lot of Hedley Bull and John Eikenberry's types of debates in the book, which was refreshing reading to me. But one of the things that I'm looking at now is that, and because my work, I got into this, as our friend John Mearsheimer calls it, the business, from back when I was kind of entering the field, the primary route by which people thought there could be US-Soviet competition was not so much the bolt out of the blue in Central Europe, but that some escalation from a peripheral area, which we then called the third world. But people called it the periphery, you know, that there was a center, there was a periphery. Now, the emerging order that you're talking about is a multipolar one, certainly kind of like with nuclear weapons and the proliferation you mentioned. And if you look at Kashmir, Himalaya, South and East China Sea, Taiwan, a ring of conflicts in the region you're talking about involving nuclear weapon states. So you had the 2019 fighting between India and Pakistan. You had the 2020 fighting between India and China in the Himalayas. And I'm wondering if you could just address that dynamic, that what the analysts call the stability instability paradox, that a stable nuclear deterrent relationship could invite adventuristic policies in other areas. But these aren't peripheral areas. All of those conflicts are central to these states. Ashley's colleague, George Perkovitz, wrote about how Pakistan might have felt emboldened by the 1998 tests to have gone ahead a year later and done Kargil. So now you have a nuclearized multipolar system, this ring of potential conflicts. And how do you, so having worked at the Pentagon, Abe, and wrestled with these, and you know so much about the development of Chinese nuclear programs, how do you see this relationship in terms of conflicts with escalatory potential, where there are conventional assets that are one break on escalation or controlling it, but in the backdrop, you've got a kind of a nuclearized set of relationships where what Albert Wohlstetter called the delicate balance of terror may not be viewed as so balanced from the perspective of some of the parties, and could invite inadvertent escalation. So it's sort of an inadvertent escalation question I'm asking in terms of this relationship, and I hope that wasn't too sort of Byzantinely complicated set of factors that I brought together there.
Yeah, it's a terrific set of questions. You know, it's a small number of people who have really looked at and worked on China nuclear issues and US-China nuclear dynamics. It's a small but merry band. And that's because nuclear issues have not played a significant role in the US-China relationship, unlike with the Soviet Union. If you think about, with the Soviet Union and Russia, if you think about all of the multilateral, I'd say all the arms control agreements that we've signed with the Soviet Union and with Russia that the Trump administration has been dismantling, and the nuclear talks that we've had with the Soviet Union going back decades, we have none of that with the Chinese. There's been one military to military meeting between the United States and China on nuclear issues, ever. And so it's just not a mature part of the relationship. It's not a significant part of the relationship. And China's approach to nuclear issues is just very different from how we approach it and from how Russia approaches it. They don't have the same Cold War experience that we do. And that has a lot of implications for how they think about escalation and crisis management and the role of nuclear weapons. When the Chinese talk about no first use, and when they talk about the role of nuclear weapons, to them, it's more of a political statement and a political tool rather than a warfighting tool, the way we talk about. And so when the Chinese are thinking about escalation, and it's very much seen, when they write about, when the PLA writes about escalation and escalation management, it's talked about in a very rational, controllable way. In that they'll write about how in a crisis, they'll turn up escalation and their adversary will react in a very predictable way. Then they'll turn down the escalation, and we'll understand each other perfectly and we'll react in very predictable ways because they don't have that experience that we have of uncontrollable escalation. So I'm actually quite concerned about that dynamic, and that's why crisis management has been such a regular part of my efforts in the Pentagon, both during the Bush and the Obama administrations. To build some degree of crisis management ability and to try to get to talk to the Chinese about strategic stability and nuclear issues, because they are important. Now, what's interesting is that this is the last point I'll make. If you think about deterrence from a Chinese perspective, that it's not only about deterring the United States. They need to deter Russia, India, the United States, and potentially North Korea, all at the same time, to the degree where they could be using nuclear weapons against one while also maintaining enough to deter the others at the same time. So multipolar deterrence is a mess. And they have been improving their capabilities both qualitatively and quantitatively over the last several years, mostly in reaction to US military modernization, especially on the conventional level, missile defenses, prompt global strike, those sorts of things. But they see it in a very different way than we do. And interestingly, I think the US decision to get out of arms control agreements, and especially the INF Treaty, I suspect has actually motivated the Chinese to want to talk to us more than they have before, because they finally see it as potentially destabilizing and contrary to their interests. And my hope is that going forward, we'll actually be able to engage in constructive discussions with them about strategic stability, about nuclear issues, and find a way to build something of a ground floor with them on these issues.
Thank you. Thanks, Abe. Got a question from Helen Davidson, a journalist with The Guardian. How far does U.S. support for Taiwan stretch if push comes to shove? And China makes a military move on Taiwan?
No. That's a perennial question for any Asia security person, and I'll tell Helen the same way I would answer that when I was in the Pentagon. I don't know. The United States doesn't have a commitment to defend Taiwan the way we have with our allies like Japan or Korea. Our laws are that we maintain the ability to defend Taiwan, and we provide Taiwan with the ability to defend themselves. But we don't have a legal statutory commitment to come to their defense. And there's only one person in the US government who can make the decision about whether or not we go to war with China over Taiwan. And that's the President of the United States. And until I'm able to definitively talk to them and look into their mind, whoever their president may be at any time, my answer is always going to be, I don't know what the United States would do in some given situation. What I'd like to say, in terms of how I think about it, is that it's a critical interest of the United States to make sure that China doesn't decide to use force against Taiwan, or doesn't decide to use force to coerce Taiwan. And that means maintaining open lines of communication with both sides. It means making sure that Taiwan has the ability to defend itself. But it also means remaining, I think, within the bounds of our One China policy and the Taiwan Relations Act. And to me, that maintaining that balance while also sustaining our ability to come to Taiwan's defense, if the president so decides, has been sufficient so far. And that's the last point I'll make. The need for the United States to maintain that ability to come to Taiwan's defense. At any point, I don't know whether a president would decide, yes, let's go defend Taiwan, or no, let's not. But if we don't maintain the ability to come to Taiwan's defense, then we're making the decision for the president. We're taking away that option. And I think that that's not good statecraft. That's not good service to an American president. We need to maintain that option so that if the time comes, if deterrence fails, that they have that they can make that decision and be able to succeed if they decide that we are going to defend Taiwan, that we have the ability to succeed and actually defend Taiwan. I think we should. I'm very committed to, I think we should come to Taiwan's defense if they're attacked for no reason. But of course, it's very much dependent on the contingency, but I think Taiwan's an important player. It's an important partner for the United States unofficially. And we need to, at the very least, maintain Taiwan's ability to defend itself and our ability to come to its aid.
Great. Two other questions from those participating via Zoom, by internet, really about U.S. relations with China. The first is, Hong Kong and how we play that in terms of supporting Hong Kong, taking into account what the Beijing regime's stance towards autonomy in Hong Kong, not legal autonomy, but just the ability of kind of a devolution of political power in Hong Kong. And the other is the perennial question, Abe, about the use of sanctions against China and how the utility, have we overused sanctions? What's your take on that? So Hong Kong and sanctions.
Yeah. Hong Kong, I think China is going to pay a price for that, for its movements on Hong Kong, for no other reason that it sends a very stark message, not only to Taiwan about China's commitments to the principles of one country, two systems, but also to the rest of the region, that China will not abide by its agreements, that China will sign agreements with the UK, for example, and then decide to ignore them when it decides that it doesn't want to abide by them anymore. In terms of what the United States could do, we could certainly raise the price, raise the cost of China for its actions. I do think that we need to be, not just when it comes to Hong Kong, but all sorts of issues when it comes to China, be it Xinjiang, Tibet, and others, to be a consistent and principled voice for human rights when we engage with China, and making sure that they know what side of the human rights question that we're on. And so, as what I expect to happen in Hong Kong in the coming years is a deepening crackdown on the freedoms and civil rights of people in Hong Kong, is that we do what we can to help those people. I know folks in the UK have been talking about what they can do to help them. I think we can stand with them, not stand with Xi Jinping, stand for human rights, maintain our principles. And the question on sanctions is relevant to that, in that there's been talk about sanctioning Chinese officials, in some ways sanctioning every member of the Chinese Communist Party. And to me, I think sanctions need to be tailored and purposeful. That whenever I hear about sanctions, to me, I always ask the question, what are we trying to accomplish with that sanction? That if there's a specific goal and we can tie the sanctions to achieving that goal, then I think it's worthwhile. But if it's just a way to express dissatisfaction and displeasure, I found that they tend to be not very effective. So when it comes to sanctioning China, I think we should look at sanctions, be it on their sanctioning officials who abuse human rights, sanctioning officials or companies that steal intellectual property from the United States, that violate international laws and norms, because those are for a specific purpose and tied to a specific fault. Blanket sanctions against every member of the Chinese Communist Party, to me, it's more difficult to make that case. But of course, it would depend on the specific sanction that we're talking about and the specific wrong that we're doing. So to me, sanctions is a tool of American power, and something that we need to be careful in its use, but not be afraid that if it's called for, we shouldn't be afraid to use it. You're muted, Rob.
I'm sorry, I had not heard about sanctioning every member of the Chinese Communist Party. That would be a pretty formidable task.
It's a long list. It's a long list.
Look, final question, Abe. You've been dealing with political, military issues, and you've talked a lot about networked kind of systems, and how the relationships cut across different categories, different domains. How should we begin thinking about, or how should we think about a cross-domain deterrence? I mean, a lot of it, we focus on kinetic aspects of it, but in the Pentagon, you also dealt with, did we need to deter, cyber attacks and a host of other kind of issues that are not just in the narrow kind of palm mill domain. So for a final question, how should we think about this complex relationship with in particular with China across various domains of competition? are we well positioned to integrate these into our own strategy to counter them?
Yeah, I think there needs to be pretty significant reform in how the United States goes about addressing these challenges. If you think about a lot of our main national security institutions, be it the Department of Defense, the CIA, the NSA, they're creatures of the Cold War. They were created, most of them, in the early years of the Cold War, including transitioning the Department of War to the Department of Defense. And so there's I think that's somewhat maybe trivia, but it suggests that when the Cold War began, American leadership saw that this was a new kind of challenge that we hadn't faced before, and that our pre-existing institutions weren't up to the task, and we needed new ones. And I think that the new challenges that we face with China, with great power competition, with these new domains, these new technologies, similarly require us to think differently about institutions and about how we address power, so that we tend to think of military issues, of war and peace, of military civilian in very binary ways. Mm-hmm. And one of the reasons that gray zone challenges have been so tough for us have been that they cross these sorts of barriers that we've put up, that they're a mix of military and civilian, they're a mix of government and non-government. Mm-hmm. And for the United States to compete with that, we need to be able to, at the least, integrate all of our national power, so that when, for example, China does some gray zone pressure against us or an ally in the South China Sea, that our responses are not just in the military realm, but also diplomatic, informational, economic, commercial, and cover the entire spectrum of what we can do. That to me is how we start getting at establishing deterrence. I mentioned before with Kelly that in a lot of these issues, questions of presence, deterrence, and reassurance are all integrated with one another. And that to me means that we need to, that integration is critical. And so I've been toying with a lot of different ideas. There's a lot of different ways that we can handle this. For example, we have an ambassador slot to ASEAN. There has not been a presidentially appointed and Senate confirmed ambassador to ASEAN since the Trump administration. It's been a charge, a DCM acting as ambassador in ASEAN. That post is not only important because of ASEAN itself, but some have been proposing, I think it's a good idea to make that person also a presidential special representative on the South China Sea, which would give them resident engagement with the Southeast Asia's key multilateral organization, but also give them the ability to marshal the resources and coordinate the resources of the entire US government on an issue area that requires intergovernmental coordination like a special representative could provide. So those are the sorts of things I think need some new thinking. It doesn't mean we need to reinvent the CIA or something like that, but it does mean taking a new look at how we approach challenges, how we understand challenges, how we approach international institutions, and making sure that we're addressing contemporary challenges with contemporary tools.
Thank you, Abe. And I'd like to thank Kelly Magsamen and Ashley Tellis for participating in today's event. The book is U.S. Strategy in the Asian Century, subtitled Empowering Allies and Partners, published by Columbia University Press in collaboration with the Wilson Center, available on Amazon for purchase. It's such a rich analysis. Abe, congratulations on the publication of your new book. Thank you for your overview leading into the really fascinating discussion. And thank you to all of those participating via internet. So with that, we are adjourned. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rob.